It's an honor to be asked to hold the annual lecture named for John Manning Ward, who became Challis Professor of History at the tender age of 29. He'd already at that point finished a law degree and been called to the bar. And so there's a sort of very fragile thread of commonality there, because I opened my undergraduate studies at this university as a student in arts law, and I still remember the expression of consternation on the faces of the officers I had to deal with when I switched from arts law to arts. They'd never encountered such a thing before. Why would someone wish to give up the beautiful futures of arts law for the somewhat less beautiful ones of an arts degree? In any case, John Manning Ward, having also abandoned the law, though he remained very interested in it, later served as the vice-chancellor of this university. He oversaw, the chancellor touched on this, the post-war period of rapid growth and transformation that brought many outstanding historians to the Department of History at Sydney. But he never, and this is, I think, a sympathetic feature, he never sought to impose a school or method of his own. It was very distinct, very different approach from that adopted by the Melbourne historians at the same time. His approach was always pluralistic and cosmopolitan. I never took Australian history as an undergraduate. This is something I now regret. But today I recognize in his work some kindred preoccupations, an interest in the relationship between state and society, in the role of law in political life, and in the management and channeling of change and upheaval as one of the central tasks of politics. And so now to an episode of upheaval from the past, the 1848 revolutions. In their combination of intensity and geographical extent, the 1848 revolutions were unique, at least in European history. Neither the Great French Revolution of 1789, nor the July Revolution of 1830, nor the Paris Commune of 1870-71, nor the Russian revolutions of 1905 or 1917 sparked a comparable transcontinental cascade. 1989 looks like a better comparator, but there is still controversy about whether these uprisings can be characterized as revolutions. In any case, their direct impact was limited to the Warsaw Pact states. In 1848, by contrast, parallel political tumults broke out across the entire continent. From Switzerland and Portugal to Wallachia and Moldavia, from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden to Palermo and the Ionian Islands. This was the only truly European revolution that there has ever been. And its effects were felt far beyond the margins of the European continent. Here's one example, this painting by a French artist called Auguste Billard, who was famous for attractive paintings of exotic locations and persons, shows grateful captives, grateful former enslaved, people receiving the news of emancipation from Governor Rostolan on the island of Martinique. In fact, nothing like this happened. What happened was that the enslaved took their freedom with their own hands as soon as they realized that a revolution had taken place in Paris and that there was talk of a general order of emancipation. They seized their own freedom. They didn't wait for Rostolan to issue his decree. And on the day that he did issue a decree, I mean, he did in the end issue a decree, he did so because he was no longer in control of the island. And this was seen as necessary to preempt further chaos. And my plan today is to reflect briefly on this political storm in the middle of the 19th century, in the hope of establishing whether it can throw light of any kind on the multiple crises of our present. Hence the title, 1848 in the rearview mirror, because it's the rearview mirror, metaphorically at least, that allows us to connect what lies ahead of us with what lies behind us. Now, this may all sound a bit odd. After all, the 19th century has practically disappeared behind the Alp of the 20th. In many US history faculties, 19th century European history is flatlining. Vital signs can no longer be detected. If I want, nevertheless, to reflect on the contemporary relevance of these mid-century revolutions, then that is because it seems to me that this era, and I'm referring here to the 19th century as a whole, is closer to us today than it was 30, 40, or 50 years ago. What do I mean by this? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. The Eastern question is with us once again. This persistent theme in 19th century international relations bundled together problems arising from the gradual enfeeblement of the Ottoman Empire, and in particular the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the course of the 20th century, this constellation was occluded from view. The Ottoman Empire was no longer in existence. Turkey was admitted to NATO, and in the light of the bipolar stability of the Cold War, the balance of power problematic on the Eastern Mediterranean no longer seemed of great importance. But in recent years, it has popped up again. We see it in the heightened geopolitical tension in the Eastern Mediterranean, the squabbling between Egypt and Turkey over the future of Libya, and in the consciously neo-Ottoman language and gestures of President Erdogan. And there we see two likable political leaders, General el-Sisi and President Erdogan. Our epoch is marked, and this is hardly a new observation, by the return of a genuine multipolarity, such as we've not known since 1945. And this multipolarity has many dimensions. New regional powers have emerged, determined to shape events in their own spheres. Turkey and Iran are just two prominent examples. The transition from Deng Xiaoping's policy of restraint under the maxim, hide your power and always be patient, to the confident demeanor of today's China is another facet of today's multipolarity. The Putin regime has opened a new and horrific conflict for which no obvious solution is in sight. And as a result of the invasion of the Ukraine, the grain exporting harbors of the Danube River Delta, which were very much in the headlines of the European newspapers in the 1840s, are once again in the headlines on the eve, well, they were especially in the headlines, of course, in the 1850s, on the eve of the Crimean War. They're once again attracting attention. This multipolarity is worrying for us, but for the people of the 19th century, it was all they knew. Just for fun, I drew up a list of phenomena from the 19th century that have resurfaced in our own time. And here I'm citing a passage in the book that Chris Hilliard just cited. One would be fluxy political constellations with minimal partisan discipline. Another would be the return of the social question. This was the signal question, the sort of moral panic of the 1840s, which bundled together lots of different problems. The problem of the effects of factory work on the health of workers, child labor, sexual morality in impoverished districts, housing crises, and so on. All of that was bundled together in something with a capital S and a capital Q, and we see it re-emerging today. The problem of the working poor was one of the great issues of that era. That's a graph showing in-work poverty. The problem of wood theft was part of the social question, much discussed in the 1840s. Here you see from Spiegel International a piece on the recent rise of wood theft. And there's another one, poachers are stealing trees from forests wherever you look. And this is my favorite one. It's a message from a German, I suppose a German whose land includes some forest. And he says, Holzdieb, du wirst keine Freude an meinem Holz haben. Ein Stück ist mit Schwarzpulver gefüllt. He says, wood thief, you will have no pleasure from my wood because I have filled one piece of it with gunpowder. And we have the return of price spikes in staple foods, which, really were a thing that once seemed to belong to the past, and supply chain crises and disruptions. And above all, we have the return of anxiety around social inequality and the right to work. And here we see Thomas Piketty, and the question here is not whether one agrees with or supports his analysis, or at least his conclusions. What's interesting about Thomas Piketty is the global interest in his work. And his work, the great classic on capitalism, has sold millions of copies worldwide. We have, in addition to all these things, labile fusions of politics and religion. We have the reawakening, despite all globalization, of classical nationalism, which we thought had become a thing of the past, re-emerging in familiar forms from an older history. We have Russia no longer as the revolutionary countermodel to the liberal democratic West, but as a socio-politically reactionary counterpole to the West, just as it was in the 19th century. Putin's toxic brew is pure Nicholas I. See, I'm not the only one who thinks this. Very different situation from the one we faced when the Soviet Union however critical one might be of its workings, operated on the basis of a sort of philosophy of history which still had a kind of grip on parts of the Western intelligentsias. That is no longer the case. Clairvoyant children with global signaling power are a distinctive feature of both eras. Is Greta Thunberg the Bernadette Soubirous of the present? In 1858, so it is said, the 14-year-old Bernadette witnessed a manifestation of the Virgin Mary. In fact, she did so many times over. And her account of this experience was so compellingly clear and so inerrant that she overcame the initial skepticism of the local clergy and laid the foundations for a global pilgrimage movement. Since 2018, Greta Thunberg, who was 15 years old when this began, has spoken to the consciences of millions. Now, one could extend this list further, and by the way, I'm not suggesting that climate change and apparitions of the Virgin Mary are in any sense equivalent phenomena. I'm just drawing attention to the formal similarity, the formal resonance between these two figures. One could extend this list further. Some of the connections are more robust than others. What matters is simply that history doesn't move in straight lines. There are moments when a history that seemed, or a past that seemed finished and locked away, suddenly moves into our vicinity. Now, if, bearing this thought in mind, we focus our attention once again on the revolutions of 1848, then a number of commonalities immediately come to mind. The interesting but difficult and frustrating thing about these revolutions is their polyvocality. The fact that so many passions, programs, and aspirations found simultaneous expression in them. Some progressive, some anything but progressive, some liberal, some radical, some conservative. For decades, the police authorities of Europe had prepared themselves for a revolution planned in advance by conspirators. And here we see revolutionary dangers of 1848 taking the oath in a secret society. European societies, or at least European policing organs, focused their attention on conspiracies, on underground networks, on secret societies, and they uncovered or infiltrated many of them using agents and spies. They were good at that. But the revolutions of 1848 were not the fruit of a conspiracy. If they had been, they might have been better organized. But in reality, they were pan-societal upheavals, moments of a general disinhibition vis-à-vis the existing political order. If we take a look at this painting by Félix Philippotto, we can see the latent tensions in a revolution that has scarcely begun. A scene unfolds in front of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris on the 25th of February, 1848. Standing on an armchair that has been taken from the building's interior, Alphonse de Lamartine addresses the milling crowd. Around him stand the men of the newly formed provisional government. Smoke wafts over the scene. The space is strewn with hints of the recent fighting, a small artillery piece, the rubble of a barricade, a dead or dying horse, a wounded fighter on a makeshift stretcher who bleeds from the bandaged stump of his right hand. On a box marked, you can't see it here, it's too far away, it's too small, but on a box marked "Collection for the Wounded" sits a bowl full of freshly donated coins. So this is evidently a generous crowd, mindful of the sacrifice of those who have fought and been wounded. Other narratives are woven into the hubbub. Near a hoard of precious objects looted from the royal palace lies an untidy corpse. It's the body of the journeyman Roux, shot by his comrades for committing a theft during the fighting. On his blood-stained chest rests a banner that you can't read at this resolution, inscribed with the words "Death to Thieves." Others are shown pushing a cart brimful of silver and gold towards safety inside the building. A man hastens to pick up and replace a silver spoon that has fallen to the ground. So this is a virtuous crowd, one that punishes thieves with death if necessary and fastidiously abstains from pilfering. Among well over 100 individual faces, many of which were painted from the life, we can make out men of the regular army, national guards, armed insurgents, laborers, apprentices and journeymen, prosperous bourgeois with brushed top hats, small boys and a few women. The space around Lamartine is marked off by a trio of huge tricolour flags bearing the legends "Abolition of the Death Penalty," words that suggest a tension with the slain thief in the foreground. The Organization of Labour is on another of these flags, near to where the socialist leader Louis Blanc can be seen. And liberty, equality, fraternity. But wading slowly through the crowd from the left is a woman in a red Phrygian cap astride a white charger. She holds aloft a red flag inscribed with the words "Vive la République." Lamartine fixes her in his gaze and raises his hand in a gesture whose meaning is deciphered by the painting's title, Lamartine rejecting the red flag in front of the Hôtel de Ville, 25th of February, 1848. Over more than 18 square meters of canvas, I mean, this is an absolutely vast painting, Félix Philippotto paints a scene of great dramaturgical complexity. Strangest of all is the temporal location of the action. The jets of burning powder flaring from guns in the background suggest a revolution that is still ongoing. The scroll of paper in Lamartine's left hand, which I've helpfully encircled in red, presumably the proclamation of the Republic, suggests a revolution that is already complete. And in the gap between a revolution that is already complete and one that is yet to end, Philippotto depicts a standoff between two political options. A woman proposes to plant the red flag of social revolution before the Hôtel de Ville. Lamartine, his waist, like those of the provisional ministers around him, wrapped in a tricolour sash, intends to prevent it. For moderate liberals like Lamartine and most of the members of the provisional government, not all, but most, the revolution is already over. For the woman with the red flag and the radical opinion she represents, it has only just begun. The mood of the scene is difficult to read. There's a willingness to collaborate, for the moment at least, despite the boundaries of class and occupation. But the facial expressions are too varied, and the members of the crowd too embroiled in local transactions to suggest a collective emotional state. And the image gives us no reason to think that when the sun rises on a new day, these people will still be willing to act together. The most stirring and memorable image of the mid-19th century revolutions is, of course, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, in which a female figure personifying liberty holds aloft the tricolour flag and guides a diverse group of male citizens over the crown of a barricade sown with corpses of the fallen. Delacroix's canvas commemorated the Parisian July Revolution of 1830. The upheavals of 1848 produced no painting of comparable allegorical intensity. In 1851, the historian Marie Dagout, who wrote far and away the best historical analysis of the revolutions, at least the French one, observed that the arts had proved completely incapable of rendering into visible form the idea that had animated the revolution of 1848. Yet the fascination of Philippotto's panorama lies precisely in its profusion of only partly coordinated actions and individuals. Delacroix's canvas may be more stirring and magnificent, but Philippotto's painting captures better the untidiness and the uncertainties of a massive popular upheaval. The 1848 revolutions were driven by forces that conflicted or were incompatible or simply cancelled each other out. The political mobilization of that year took many forms: new ministries, radical clubs, violence on the streets, electoral campaigns and parliamentary debates, women's clubs, attacks on police, customs officials and soldiers, biting caricatures, attacks on members of parliament, fights between national guardists and members of student legions, attacks on Jewish citizens and their property, or simply on foreigners and strangers. In the wooded areas of southern France, a war broke out, the so-called War of the Girls, la guerre des demoiselles, between peasants dressed as women and state forestry officials. This too belongs to the 1848 revolutions, even if the peasants were fighting against the state forestry administration, and therefore also against the newly formed republic, which sent troops, incidentally, to suppress their insurrection. Nationally minded Austrian and German radicals and liberals rejoiced when Prussian and Austrian armies suppressed the Polish and Czech liberation movements, apparently unaware that these very same armies would soon be putting down German and Austrian revolutions. Liberals were afraid of reaction, of counter-revolution, but also of democracy, and were sometimes unable to tell which they feared more. Radicals were afraid of the aroused mob, even as they were in the process of arousing it. The coalitions that formed in March 1848 soon spiraled off in different directions. Nothing cohered. For contemporaries then, it was often difficult to make out the general direction of travel. So paradoxical and so contradictory were the forces that the revolution had unleashed. You could even say the revolution and the counter-revolution were born twins in one bed. That is the complexity of 1848. And it's, of course, quite difficult for historians to narrate this kind of trajectory, because it's not one trajectory, but a sort of plethora of, very confused and contradictory trajectories. And it's, to me at least, very interesting that although historians, perhaps of the era, found this very difficult to navigate, there were scientists who were thinking about analogous problems in the physical sciences. In a celebrated paper published in 1850, entitled On the Motive Force of Heat, the research for which he did during the revolutions, über die bewegende Kraft der Wärme, Clausius, whom we see here, a Prussian, Rudolf Clausius in Berlin, observed that the operation of the heat engine proposed by Carnot in the 1820s was irreconcilable with the principle of the conservation of energy, because he noted that there was no steam engine that did not lose an enormous amount of heat. There was no steam engine that could turn all of its fuel into motion. And he, instead of thinking, how can we build bigger, better steam engines, Clausius turned his attention instead to the problem of why heat is always lost. Throughout the 1850s, he continued to reflect on this problem of the dissipation of heat in the course of irreversible thermodynamic processes. And in 1865, he gave this irreversible heat loss a name, entropy. Now, the link is not direct, of course. It's not that he looked out the windows and thought, oh, that's what's happening with heat. But the language of scientists, the language they use to talk about these things, is astonishingly good at describing social effects. They talked about the loss of cohesion, the dissipation of effort, heat death, the passing of energy from a hot body into a cooler one. And it's interesting to note that many scientists became political activists. The traffic between those professions was much thicker and much more lively than one might think. There were many scientists, many distinguished scientists, on the occupying ministries in the Parisian provisional government created in February 1848, and the great Polish freedom fighter who fought on virtually every front in the 1848 revolutions, Józef Bem, who wound up fighting for the Hungarian revolutionaries in 1849. He was actually the author of quite a distinguished scientific paper on the steam engine. This complexity of 1848, its entropic character, was not a function, and it's important to emphasize this, of the intrinsic difficulty of the problems that had confronted pre-revolutionary societies. Rather, it resulted from the great number and diversity of political groups and perspectives. During these revolutions, many new newspapers were born, generating a superabundance of new ideas and narratives that aroused a certain ambivalence among contemporaries. This is a very typical image of newspapers on the streets of 1848, among other things because of the presence of a woman distributing these or selling these papers, and female sellers of newspapers. The Zeitschriftenweiber, as they were known in Austria, for example, were stock characters in the sort of street lore of the revolutions. But in any case, this superabundance of opinions and ideas and narratives aroused a certain ambivalence. People's political world had not yet been structured and disciplined by the great mass parties and the political milieus that became their catchment in a later era. The diversity of voices and programs was exciting, but it was easy to feel overwhelmed. And here we can see an image of someone who's feeling a bit overwhelmed. And it's interesting to see how often one encounters, even in the liberal papers of this era, skepticism about the newly won freedom of the press being one of the absolutely ubiquitous demands you can find wherever the revolution was coming to the boil. Many were concerned at the growing sharpness of the tone of public life. In Vienna, it was suddenly fashionable to denounce individuals by name in the press. This had never been known before. That was something new. For the first time, anonymous threatening letters, today we would call their writers trolls and their messages hate mails, made the rounds of the city, another unknown phenomenon. In this respect, the people of 1848 are our contemporaries. Some images from the time of revolution speak to us in a different way, in a direct way. At least this one speaks to me. Here we can see how an aroused mob broke into the Constituent Assembly in Paris, the Assemblée Constituante, on the 15th of May, 1848, in order to protest the measures of the government. They disrupted the debate. They were angry about the outcome of the elections, which had produced a minority for the left. I mean, the left had a substantial presence, but it was not close to a majority. That was a body blow for the French left. In fact, left parties left factions right across Europe would experience similar body blows when they realized that the extension of the suffrage was not going to translate, not immediately at least, into a massive expansion of the sort of attraction of the left. They tended to produce, enlarged suffrages tended to produce moderate and conservative assemblies rather than radical ones. In any case, this group, angry about that and about other things, broke into the chamber. They announced that the incumbent government was henceforth dissolved on the authority of the group itself. A new government was waiting in the wings, and the names were read out, would soon take power. Well, of course, nothing came of this because the National Guard turned up and chased them off. The business of Parliament soon resumed. And here we see members of another aroused mob breaking into a parliamentary chamber. I mean, this man has earned himself a sad fame in the world, but I think he would otherwise be a completely unknown figure. But there he is, the QAnon shaman. There's still controversy, of course, about whether we should call this event an uprising, an attempted coup d'etat, or simply a protest, but the general point is clear. In both cases, liberal democracy was challenged, placed in question in the most dramatic way. The revolutions of 1848 seemed as old as ancient Egypt when I learned about them at school. Their complexity was, and I still remember our school teacher explaining to us at school that the revolutions of 1848 were, as he put it, they were complicated and they were a failure. And I remember thinking, well, that's an extremely unattractive combination. And I resolved at that moment never to study them. But anyway, their complexity seemed in retrospect a sort of futile antiquarian scribble. It didn't seem to generate the kinds of narratives that replenish modern people. But it seems to me that something has changed in our perspective on these events. We are re-emerging from something that they did not yet know. The era of high industrialization, what Walt Rostow called the takeoff into sustained growth, the rise of the great ideological party political formations, the ascendancy of the nation state and of the welfare state, the age of secularization, the rise of the great newspapers and the national television or radio audience. These things, which we used to call modernity, are now themselves in flux. Their hold on us is waning. The old trigonometry of right and left, which we used to use to plot and describe our paths as political beings, doesn't work anymore. In a report published on the 7th of July 2022, the German Verfassungsschutz, this is the body entrusted with surveying or keeping an eye on bodies which are planning or conspiring to threaten the constitutional order, announced that for the first time since their foundation in 1949, they were opening a new observational category for groups and entities hostile to the constitutional order, but not straightforwardly assignable either to the left or to the right. Things had been so simple before that. You had left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists, and nothing in between. Well, not anymore. The puzzlement generated by new movements, Trump rallies. I mean, it never gets old, does it? Occupy Wall Street, QAnon, the Gilets jaunes, anti-vaccination protests. More people have been stupefied by corona than have died from it, they claim. All of these things are symptoms of this transition. But if we read these upheavals against the turmoil of the mid-19th century revolutions, they seem much less unfamiliar. The storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January in Washington, D.C. was thick with echoes. I've already mentioned the invasion of a chamber by an unruly mob, the rejection of the election process by the right this time, not by the left, as in 1848, as a snare and a lie, the improvised theatricality and the outlandish outfits, the euphoric posturing coupled with appeals to higher principle, freedom, rights, the Constitution, all recalled the tumults of 1848. The Freedom Convoy, as they called themselves, of truckers that paralyzed downtown Ottawa for 3 weeks in January and February 2022, manifested with its bouncy castles, hot tubs, and repudiation of parliamentary democracy, a blend of carnivalesque style and insurrectionary logic that recalled the street protests of 1848. The unstable leadership structures, the partial fusion of disparate ideologies, and the mobile, protean, and improvised quality of much present-day political dissent are reminiscent of the 1840s, and so are the efforts of intellectuals to make sense of them. Ross Douthat's interpretation of the Freedom Convoy as the latest battle in a new class war between what he calls virtuals, that's educated elites, and practicals, that's people who do stuff with their hands, recalls the opposition between idlers and industrials, paresseux and industriels, invoked by the followers of Saint-Simon, a hugely influential figure in the 1840s, and in particular in the 1848 revolutions, though he'd been dead since 1827. The Memorandum of Understanding drafted by the protesters in Ottawa, a document composed in faux official language, deposing the current government and demanding the immediate suspension of the unconstitutional regulations enacted to control the spread of COVID, looks much less outlandish if we place it alongside the petitions and manifestos of 1848. George Packard's observation that what he called the working class has become terra incognita to the smart cosmopolitan elites of the cities recalls the mysteries literature of the 1840s. These were books that began with Eugène Sue's Mystères de Paris, Mysteries of Paris in the 1840s, books which documented in a sort of documentary realist style the conditions in the sort of quarters and in the dwellings of the very poorest urban citizens, showing that right underneath the nose of the wealthy living in their attractive streets with very long life expectancies were areas they knew nothing of, in which people were dying on average before their 35th birthday. In general, the heightened ambient awareness of precarity and the preoccupation with waning social cohesion recall the grim diagnoses of the 1840s. In an historically important speech, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke of a turning of the times, a Zeitenwende, for lack of a better translation. The term Wende has been used 4 times in the modern history of Germany to describe an encompassing societal course correction. The first time was in connection with the seizure of power by the National Socialists in 1933. Then again in 1953, when the Socialist Unity Party and the German Democratic Republic briefly took up the word Wende to characterize the adoption of a new, slightly more liberal and West-friendly course. And then in the 80s, in the context of the geistig-moralische Wende, the spiritual and moral turn of Helmut Kohl, a turn to the right. And finally, for the process, it's been used for the process of encompassing societal change that took place at the end of the German Democratic Republic. Its abolition, among other things, its removal and the absorption of its population into the German Federal Republic. All these events were referred to in their time as a Wende. And in all 4 cases, we're talking about a turn to the right, away from the Weimar Republic towards National Socialism, away from Stalinism into the new course, if you can think of that as left to right, I suppose it's questionable, away from the left liberal cultural legacy of the 1960s and 70s towards the affirmation of liberal conservative values in the 80s, away from SED rule in the German Democratic Republic towards national unification, capitalism, and integration into the West. Now, historians mostly, not always, but mostly manage without diagrams. But if I were a social scientist, I might say, and I'm operating way out of my comfort zone here, I might say that a pan-societal change of course, going by this background, ought to look something like this. But you don't have to be a social scientist. You don't even have to have studied anything to see that this diagram is simply too dumb to capture the ultra-complex dynamic of our societies and their chaotic engagement with the most urgent political problems that they face. We are standing before the first general crisis of the Anthropocene. What distinguishes our time is the deepening fusion of once distinct crises. Migration crises, the global financial crisis, the attendant loss of cohesion in politics, the growing tension between the great powers, social inequality as a problem within but also between states. These and other skeins of problems are all intertwined with each other. We're looking at an aggregate of old and new crises. And if we were to map this complexity with its many interdependencies diagrammatically, in the form of a diagram, the result would have to look something like this. In fact, and of course, this is also how 1848 would look if you tried to render it in diagrammatic form. And this is an attempt which is made by management consultants using a so-called causal loop diagram to represent the problem posed by Mexican drug cartels. The next one is a diagram put together by, sorry, it's a bit out of focus, but these are Australian scientists who've mapped the interdependencies between environmental, health, and economic policy fields in the struggle to manage the COVID pandemic. And here is a schematic representation of the factors and problems that need to be addressed for the stabilization of Afghanistan. So, I mean, if you look at this, you can perhaps understand why that hasn't happened yet. Again, this was prepared by a consultancy firm. This is the COIN diagram. It's PA Consulting Group did this. We have them to thank. And it was very widely seen and discussed. And I sometimes wonder, looking at these things, whether a diagram like this is supposed to actually give us advice, or is it supposed to suggest it's hopeless, just go home, forget it. Finally, there's this very recent one. This is a World Economic Forum Perception Survey Global Risks Interconnections map. Okay, so today the measures adopted by governments to mute the effects of climate change are judged, of course, and rightly so, not just in terms of their effectiveness in achieving that objective, but also in terms of their social impact, of their distributive effects. We've all seen how difficult it is to reconcile the global exit from coal with the political interests of specific countries. And this resistance to the solutions offered reproduces itself at every decisional layer, because it won't just be a matter of international agreements, but also of difficult domestic compromises. And the quest for a comprehensive solution is rendered even more difficult by the fact that the means employed to solve one problem may simultaneously worsen another. For example, it could be that the measures taken in some states to mitigate climate change could also create heightened geopolitical tension with one or more states. But the causation might also work in the other direction. It could be, and we've seen this in recent years, that heightened geopolitical tension or even geopolitical conflict could become intertwined with problems of social and welfare policy, as we saw with the effects of the spike in grain prices and in fuel prices on even very prosperous Western societies. In an article he wrote about the forestry industry in the Rhineland in the 1840s, the young Karl Marx, he wrote an astonishing amount about forests, Karl Marx, in the 1840s. He found them very, very interesting. And there are 11 or 12 of these very sophisticated essays analyzing the political economy of forestry. And he said in the course of one of these essays, and I quote, "The bewildering multifacetedness of the world is a function of the one-sidedness of its many constituent parts." So I'll just say that again. The bewildering multifacetedness of the world is a function of the one-sidedness of its many constituent parts. And by that he meant that the problems of political economy are only as complex as they are because the persons and groups affected by them cling so stubbornly to their particular conflicting interests. Now, I'm not saying that looking back at 1848 can show us how to extricate ourselves from today's world historical polycrisis. Obviously, it cannot. But it does offer us the picture of a complex crisis, and it invites us to reflect on the fraught relationship between general and particular needs. Between the people of 1848 and us lies the epoch of high industrialization, the emergence of the great political parties, I've touched on this already, of national media cultures, of material saturation, at least in the West, for some strata. They stood on the eve of this era of transformation. We stand at its end. We are about to take our leave of something that they did not yet know. And perhaps that's why we see resonances between our time and theirs, or perhaps that's why these resonances have become more visible. Whether the exit from this era will be as tumultuous as our journey into and through it remains to be seen. But as we cease to be the creatures of high modernity, new affinities become possible. It becomes engrossing, even instructive, to contemplate the people and situations of 1848. the fissured, multifarious quality of their politics, the churn and change without a settled sense of the direction of travel, the anxieties around inequality and the finiteness of resources, the lethal entanglement of civil tumult with international relations, the eruption of violence, utopia, and spirituality into politics. If a revolution is coming, and I'm not saying one is coming, but if one is coming, and we do seem, I must say, rather far removed from a non-revolutionary solution to the polycrisis we currently face, then it may look something like 1848, poorly planned, highly dispersed, patchy, and bristling with contradictions. Thank you very much.